How did you first get interested in space and start working in space?
Well, there's an interesting story that my aunt, who's no longer with us, used to tell me and lots of other people. And that is when I first started learning how to talk, I was talking with a lisp. And as a consequence, all the adults thought it was amusing to ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And my answer was, I want to be a space scientist. So I don't actually remember anything at that age. So my conclusion is it's hardwired genetic. Later on, I was always very interested in doing things which would sort of expand humanity's reach. I remember when I was in elementary school, I organized a group of people, of kids, and we went around and mowed people's lawns in order to earn money to buy an icebreaker so we could go colonize Antarctica. After a while, I got a better idea, and that was to colonize, to advance into space. When I was in high school, I sat down and said, well, how can I actually get humanity to advance into space in a big way? And I said, well, there's this guy named Einstein, and he said you can't go faster than the speed of light. And so I thought, if we could get a cheap way of going faster than the speed of light, then that would solve all the problems, because it would just be automatic after that we go off and colonize everything. So I said, okay, so I'm going to become a theoretical physicist and study relativity theory and cosmology and figure out how to beat Einstein. So I studied physics pretty hard, and I went off to Caltech to become a physicist. And by the time I got to about middle of my junior year, it finally dawned on me that no matter how hard I worked, because I had been working roughly biological maximum at that point, I was not going to be the physicist who discovered this sort of thing. I was smart, but not that smart. So I started looking for other ways of doing it. And it occurred to me that at the time, there was two things going on. The space program was falling apart because after the Apollo program had sort of run its course, there was huge cuts in the space budgets. And secondly, there were all kinds of movements that were going on, like anti-war movement and civil rights movements and stuff like that. So I said, you know what we should do? The one thing, or one of the major things, which is missing from the pro-space community, which at that time was just people who work for NASA and aerospace companies, we want a movement. We want a space movement. And so I started studying about movements and thinking about that. And I went off to Harvard to get a graduate degree in economics. And I set up there with three other people the Harvard Radcliffe Committee for Space Economy in 1972, and started thinking about ways to do a space movement. And the thought was that there's a lot of economies of scale with regards to space if you do much more than on the ground. So if you do any one big project, you will develop technology which is very useful for large numbers of other projects. And so if we could get one big application, this would really, really drive the space program further. And so we were looking for that one big application. We looked at the possibility of space solar power that Peter Glaser was promoting at the time. And it didn't seem any way to close the business case. And in other words, get the power at a sufficiently low price so it's competitive. And then Gerard O'Neill came along, and he wrote this article in Physics Today, which I read. It was all about space settlements, which looked pretty cool, but there's nothing in that article to explain how these colonies would be economically viable. So, being a brash graduate student that I was, and I was brash, of course I'm not brash now, but anyway, I called him up on the phone and said, well, this is great stuff, and it's relatively easy to get professors on the phone. So I called him on the phone, and this is really great stuff, but how do you pay for it? And Gerard O'Neill was one of these guys that was his personality was very proper British type personality. So there was this long pause, and then he said, as he was sort of taken aback by this brash young graduate student. And so then he started explaining the possibility of building space solar power satellites using one of his space colonies as a manufacturing center. And so I said, well, okay, that might work. And I then got this invitation in the mail a few months later to go to the 1975 Princeton conference on space colonies. And so I went there, and nobody did any economics. So throughout the conference, I kept raising my hand and asking all these engineers for prices and stuff. And at the end of the thing, I got up and said, well, if you believe all these engineers, then, and you run a cost-benefit analysis, then this thing makes money. And that resulted in O'Neill inviting me to the 1975 summer study at NASA Ames, NASA-led study. And after that, I was hooked. So,
how did you first get involved with the L5 and eventually National Space Society?
Well, I helped create the L5 Society. Like I said in an earlier segment, I was very interested in creating space movement. And after Gerard O'Neill's ideas came out, and there was this 1975 summer study, which was sponsored by NASA, which I went to, and by the end of the study, I figured that the ideas, I actually believed that this would work, like everybody else there. I wasn't so obvious to me when I walked in, but we spent 10 weeks studying it. The Hensons, I'd actually met them a couple of months earlier at the 1975 Princeton conference, and they had experience in movements. In particular, Carolyn Henson had been very active in a number of movements. And furthermore, they were willing to do work on stuff. So I encouraged them to do something, start an organization. And that eventually resulted in the L5 Society a few months later, which was dedicated to the ideas of Gerard O'Neill and was put together sort of like a movement typical of the times. The Hensons were quite intelligent and quite competent and had zero money. So the whole organization started off with less than a shoestring. The original funding source was O'Neill gave them his list of about 300 people who were interested in space settlements. And they mailed that list and got about 30 people to sign up for the L5 Society at, I think it was $20 dues. So 20 times 30, that's $600. And that was the initial funding for the L5 Society. And they put out a newsletter, 4-page newsletter called the L5 News. And they started putting that out monthly, and it just grew virally after that.